His presentation is titled The Space of Reasons, the Role of Academic Judgment in Assessment, which would be followed by Professor Heinz-Dieter Mayer's talk titled The Limits of Measurement. Professor Mayer is the School of Education, State University of New York, Albany. This session would be chaired by Professor John Furlong.
You can all hear me at the back? Good. Well, I'd just like to thank Rohit Dankar for inviting me to this conference and inviting me to speak. And I'd like to thank Ravi Prakash for all his organisation and all colleagues here who've made this conference happen. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to talk about the space of reasons and the role of academic judgment in assessment. But first of all, I'm going to start off with Plato. Excuse me. This thing's not working. Okay, thanks. I'll give it a couple of minutes, half a minute, as people come in. Okay, can you hurry up and sit down? Thank you very much. In Book 7 of the Republic, Plato's Republic, written 2,500 years ago, Plato asks us to think of a deep, dark, large cave in which people are tied up facing a huge screen. Behind them is a fire, and in between the fire and the people is a road along which people pass. But those people can only see the screen on which flicker images of the people on the road behind. In the cave, they can't see the road or the fire, only the flickering images produced by the fire. So all the people can see are those flickering images. Plato suggests that the people will take the flickering images as reality. So, what does this metaphor mean? What does it represent for us? Well, Plato develops a theme in this section of the Republic. He speculates that the cave dwellers may get quite good at recognizing these shadows, and we can even suppose that they may award each other prizes for spotting the most interesting combinations of sound and image. Not to mention prizes for being able to make correct predictions as to what kind of shadows will fall on the wall next. But then maybe if someone had managed to escape from the cave and spent time above ground, on their return they would be somewhat less interested in the prizes that the cave dwellers so eagerly value. What is more, the returnee may not be very good at discriminating the flickers, for he may have let all his old skills go rusty. He may well make a complete fool of himself, and the cave dwellers would say that his visit to the upper world had ruined his sight. So with his new knowledge, the returnee would no longer be able to play an interpretive part in their world. The cave is a powerful metaphor because it is utterly uncompromising. What the returnee knows is now entirely incommensurate with what he used to know, to the extent that what he used to know is now quite valueless. The incommensurability between the cave dwellers and those who have escaped has nothing to do with social position or social recognition. The incommensurability is not positional, it is epistemic. The uncompromising nature of the metaphor is driven home when one sees that the cave dwellers cannot even use the flickers on the wall as a basis for knowing, because such knowing is based on error and illusion. When persons leave the cave, they have to unlearn the valueless knowledge that they have already acquired in the cave. The fact that they believe otherwise, that is, if they stay in the cave and believe otherwise, merely serves to emphasize the utterly hopeless position in which they are in. The only way to shift their perspective is to give them an entirely different experience on which to build an interpretive and explanatory structure. But in leaving the cave behind, for Plato, the sunlit uplands of true knowing take the character of a contemplative ideal. And as is well known, the forms of knowledge that he advocates are unchanging, abstract entities. For example, the idea of goodness, of beauty. Their ineffability was criticised by Aristotle, one of Plato's first critics. But Plato's account still retains its power, and even today, my students at university get the point of the cave metaphor and have no trouble seeing similarities between cave dwellers in the Republic and today. For example, people who are obsessed with celebrities. But although the cave metaphor still resonates, for educational purposes as well as philosophical purposes, we do need an account of knowledge which supplements the metaphor without displacing it. Well, it's over 50 years ago now that a celebrated English philosopher of education, Paul Hirst, gave an account of the relationship between knowledge and the curriculum. This is his account in his article Liberal Education and the Nature of Knowledge. He starts off by treating knowledge as drawn from as opposed to mere contemplation. And this system of concepts, these conceptualizations of experience, takes the form of publicly known and shared criteria for their application. It is this that allows experiences to be recognized, evaluated, compared, and tested. Hirst's account of knowledge is interesting because he tries to link up knowledge with experience. Knowledge is the way we interpret, understand, and explain our experiences. So knowledge is not something out there. And of course, there will always be new configurations of subjects and disciplines, which is what you would expect if knowledge tracks experience. So in a way, his forms of knowledge could equally be seen as forms of experience. But for all that Hirst achieved, one could argue that Hirst does seem to suggest that knowledge is essentially propositional, made up of inert theorems and informational sets. I don't think for one moment that Hirst ever really thought this, but this criticism could be read into his accounts, and often has been. So we need some way of developing his ideas so that the dynamic, shifting character of knowledge is somehow built into his account. And if we can do this, then there's a promise of a lively, dynamic shifting curriculum as well. So somehow we need to think of knowledge in terms of discovery and justification, of argument and counter-argument. How should we do this? Well, there's a philosopher called John McDowell. He's based in Pittsburgh, where another gentleman called Robert Brandom is based, and where an eminent philosopher, Wilfrid Sellers, was based. And McDowell takes some of his thinking from Sellers. McDowell contrasted what he terms the space of reasons with the realm of natural law. And this is in his book, Mind and World. The realm of natural law is roughly the realm of propositional knowledge, for example, the laws of physics. But the space of reasons relates to that human space in which we ask for and give reasons. We have to justify and give an account of our beliefs. Whereas the realm of raw law is essentially causal and explanatory, the space of reasons is justificatory. Of course, if propositions in the realm of law become open to doubt, then they themselves would have to be justified within the space of reasons. Just one further point here, that for McDowell it's important that the space of reasons has some grip on the world. Not anything can count as a reason, and to think it can is to suppose that our belief systems can operate independently of how the world is. He calls this spinning in a void. So that would be the critique of relativist systems of thought. He thinks that we need to think of the world as constraining our beliefs. But it does not follow that in constraining our beliefs that they are outside of what is thinkable. So, for McDowell, experience never comes as just raw sense data, but as already conceptualized. So, a conceptualized experience does act as a constraint upon belief, which potentially can answer to the world's being thus and so. This is how the world is. Even if in practice I treat my beliefs as provisional and open to review, as would happen if it was subject to the space of reasons. Indeed, that I do treat my beliefs as open to review is just what one would expect the moment those beliefs become part of the space of reasons. McDowell thinks that we can become attuned to living in the space of reasons through the development of what he calls a second nature. This nature is not biological, but cognitive. So our first nature is biological, our second nature is a cognitive nature, and is exemplified by the way in which we conceptualize experience and justify our beliefs. It is a form of acculturation, and in this connection he also mentions and explicates the role of Bildung in the space of reasons. Bildung is a German concept of upbringing, of self-formation, of acculturation. So you can see that in McDowell's system, education has a role to play, which is not merely cultural and moral, but also epistemological. Because through learning, we learn to conceptualize the world. And in conceptualizing the world, we experience the world differently from what we would do if we did not have this second nature. But how does knowledge relate to the space of reasons? So what I suggest then is that we can think of knowledge, that is including the subject disciplines, as existing in the space of reasons. From an educational point of view, what we want is for our students to learn to live in the space of reasons. This means that not only do they know lots of content and stuff, but that they're also capable of justifying their beliefs and making judgments. Because what we really want to get our students to do is to make judgments and to get used to defending and criticising judgments. In that way, they may learn that knowledge doesn't come in neatly packaged bundles in textbooks, but is something difficult, not clear-cut. In addition, making and defending judgments helps students to learn how to become responsible for those judgments so that they own those judgments. We can think of school, and university indeed, but also a school, as a place where the space of reasons prevails, even for young children. Sometimes they may come from homes where reasons aren't given. They just have to learn to obey. They're subject to the will of the parent. But in a school, at least in any school worth its name, the children learn that there is always a reason for what they're being asked to do. Maybe that reason can't always be given straight away. The child might be in danger, for example. But nevertheless, it can always be given later. The idea of making judgments in schools and universities is important because we want children and students to own their own beliefs, to take responsibility for what they believe in. But in a school environment, the consequences of getting it wrong are usually benign. But out in the real world, the consequences of getting it wrong, of course, are not always so benign. So, thinking now about assessment, if we think of learning and ask what we want students to learn, in some ways, and I'm simplifying here, the answer could be said to be fairly straightforward. 1, basic theorems and information, plus a bunch of skills, technical skills perhaps, soft skills as they're called. 2, understanding of associated context, and I won't elaborate that. We all presumably recognise that facts and information have to be contextualised in order for understanding to take place. But finally, judgments, which I've already spoken about. Context is always important because understanding context tells us the extent to which students understand basic content. One of the problems with multiple questions is that it doesn't ask for context. So if someone was to ask me, if someone was to ask who is the Prime Minister of the UK, and the answer was David Cameron, that answer would be correct. But if that person also thought that David Cameron had been born in a council house and went to a state school, it would show that they knew nothing about David Cameron, who actually came from a very privileged background. So context is everything. But coming to judgments are related to context and content. But there are no skills in judging that can be learnt apart from content. This implies that judgments are not easily transferable from one knowledge domain to another. But we can learn what it means to be responsible for our judgments and how they might be justified. We want our students to learn to become mature in their judgments. Looking at that list again, information, theorems, skills, associated context and judgments, it seems a fairly linear pattern, but things are not always so simple. In the UK, there is much talk of threshold concepts. These are the concepts that you need to know in a particular discipline if your understanding is going to really take off. Lack of understanding of these threshold concepts can act as a bottleneck. But once one does understand a particular concept, a threshold concept, then the whole vistas open up. The idea is that each discipline is likely to have its own set of threshold concepts. So in my experience, for example, in teaching educational theory, nearly all students, to begin with, have immense difficulty in seeing the intrinsic link between freedom and reason. For philosophers, it's easy. It's a basic Kantian insight. The powers of reason enable self-directedness in respect of appraising values and determining one's purposes that provide the basic condition for freedom. But no amount of examples and case studies is ever enough for students to learn this. You just have to wait until the penny drops. Then they start to see the whole point of the Enlightenment, and they start to see why the overused concept of freedom is so powerful when used properly. Another concept which I regard as a threshold concept in educational theory is the concept of knowledge itself, because the students naturally assume that knowledge simply consists of facts and basic propositions. But having mastered at least some of these threshold concepts, and to be able to use them in the space of reasons, it is at that point they can start to make judgments about the limits of reason and the limits of freedom. So having understood the Kantian insight, maybe they can even come to question it even. Okay. So my example there then of the freedom and reason as being a threshold concept and seeing the link between the two, once they have grasped it, then yes, for them the discipline does open up. They understand, for example, what we mean by the Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment, for example. So whilst this linear progression of learning that I've outlined is not without its merits, it doesn't tell the whole story of the difficulty and pain in getting to make judgments that are interesting. And of course, judgments can be turned toward context and content in the form of an internal critique. And with a good class, this can happen sooner than you think. When we come to assess as teachers, as lecturers, as tutors, when we come to assess, we need to be clear in our minds what we are assessing. Are we assessing knowledge of content and context, or are we assessing judgments and how well-founded they are? When I listen to colleagues in higher education in the UK, I worry sometimes that their assessment strategies only cover content and its context. I worry sometimes that we don't really know how to assess judgments, or to judge judgments, if you will. It is as if we are reluctant ourselves to let students enter the space of reasons in a full-blown way, and our reluctance is exemplified by our having assessment methods that play safe, that are risk-free. But you can see that once students start making judgments, then they are well out of the cave and right up there in the sunlit uplands of enlightenment. So the space of reasons is a modern philosopher's answer to the cave. For Plato, the cave is a bad place to be. And he favoured what was essentially a contemplative style of knowledge and wisdom. Sometimes I think Plato was right, especially when I read dialogues like the Symposium. Plato has immense power and persuasiveness that reaches across the years and affects us today. Nevertheless, for us moderns, and I include by us moderns everyone who lives in the Indian subcontinent, I think the space of reasons is the place to be and where we need to be. For us, this space is the alternative to living in the cave. But in assessing judgments, we have to educate students into the art of making judgments, no matter what subject they are taking. We need them to understand that we don't just want to assess their knowledge of content and context. We have to educate them to take risks, even if sometimes that doesn't pay off. Because students have to learn, and they must learn, what a bad judgment is. And the best way you can do that is by making some bad judgments yourself. By the way, it would be wrong, I think, to associate the cave simply with the world of the mundane, the everyday, the world of practical problems and relations with our friends, family and colleagues, with our domestic life, for example. The world of the everyday has its dignity as well, and there is no reason at all why we should think of this in terms of the cave. The space of reasons, then, goes all the way down, from science and philosophy to practical matters that affect all of us, whoever we are. So it's in that sense we all live in the space of reasons where we all learn to make responsible judgments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey. We've now got nearly 20 minutes for discussion. How do you like to take the questions, one at a time or multiple?
One at a time to begin with.
One at a time. Okay, fine. First question, please. Yes. And if we can keep questions relatively short rather than speeches, and get more people in.
Two very short points and one very short question. The first point, you stressed that I think that you interpret McDowell correctly, that experiences are always conceptualized. But on the other hand, McDowell and you are talking about conceptualizing of experiences as task of education. So is there not a contradiction? And the pedagogical clue of that question is how you can address non-cognitive or precognitive experiences or intuitions of the students in the classroom in order to bring them to conceptual articulation. So the first point. Second point, I think this is misleading to interpret Bildung as acculturization, because Bildung, according to Humboldt and to Hegel, is about transcending the limitations of a given culture. So Bildung goes hand in hand with taking a cosmopolitan perspective. And the very short question, what is a bad judgment? Do you have any criteria, any norms in order to distinguish between good and bad judgments?
I wasn't quite clear what you meant by a known cognitive experience. A known cognitive experience still is well, it seems to me that a known cognitive experience is still something that needs to be conceptualized. So, for example, if I'm faced with the colour red, then I won't be able to conceptualize it as red and say red unless, for example, I already have some concept of the colour schemes. So in that sense, that's what McDowell's arguing. The point about Bildung, yes, I take your point, and it may well be that McDowell's is using it for his own purposes in a slightly different way. But he's using it in terms of the growth of this second nature that we put on ourselves, and it seems to me that learning is a part of that. And of course, a lot of our learning is informal, but as an educationalist, one can see that second nature also occurs. The growth of second nature also occurs in schools. Bad judgment. Yeah, no, it's. Well, first of all, there's a sense in which the space of reasons. There are good reasons. There are good reasons and bad reasons. And what one hopes that in the space of reasons there's a kind of a survival of the fittest, and that the bad reasons get driven out by good reasons. But I guess there'll always be bad reasons, but hopefully they will be supplanted. But bad reasons will always occur. But I think that a bad judgment, in terms of is one that, in a pedagogical way, there's two things really. I mean, first of all, a bad judgment is one that fails to take account of context in an adequate way, and secondly, a bad judgment is one that doesn't understand and fails to demonstrate an understanding of what I've called the threshold concepts. So take a threshold concept like freedom and reason, but not seeing that those two are linked and the dynamic link between them, but thinking of freedom and reason in a pedestrian, prosaic, everyday kind of way. And that's the problem I find with some of my students, is that they write their essays, they do the reading, they understand the context, but when it comes to the conceptual grasp, that's lacking. But it's quite difficult to articulate exactly what you mean, and that's my point. We want, in the UK, I'm sure in India as well, increasingly, specify your assessment criteria. And my point is that when it comes to judgments, you may not be able to specify those criteria in an exact and precise way.
In a bit in continuation of what was being said, how does one really overcome this continued concern of paternalism in this idea of enlightenment? Like, how do we know when the child is ready and, in a sense, now knows how to make judgment? And, otherwise we're constantly sort of caught in the paternalism which we've always found in enlightenment. Also, I was wondering about the use of the phrase word reasons, because you have the word reason as well, which seems more like a sort of a basic a position of inquiry, and then reasons seems far more epistemological, explanations, judgments. So how are you seeing the two together? I was wondering.
Sorry, how do I do which two together?
As in, you've used the word reason and space of reasons, both of these in your presentation.
Yeah.
So I was wondering why reasons, and why such a limited, like a very specific explanation, epistemology based term, and then suddenly the idea of reason as an abstract space.
Well, I mean, I think that if you have a well-founded school, by well-founded school I mean a school that is run on reasons rather than the will of teachers, a school where children are encouraged to listen to each other and to respond appropriately, then if you already have that school which is run on those lines, then I think you can be confident that the children will grow up as responsible, mature inhabitants of the space of reasons. Okay. With the other question, the thing is that when I have an experience, it may be an aesthetic experience, not an epistemological experience, but an aesthetic experience, or say. The point is that I have an experience that then produces a belief, and it's that belief or a set of beliefs that then become subject to reasoning, subject to inquiring, subject to testing. So it's the beliefs that can be tested through reason within the space of reasons. But it doesn't need to be a rationalistic belief. It could be a belief that arises, as I say, from an aesthetic experience or from some kind of emotional experience. Does that help?
Yeah. I have like a continuation in some ways, because I was also intrigued by the use of reasons. And in Indian context, if you see our education system and the whole hangover from the colonization project of education, this idea of one universal Kantian reason has led to us look at our pre-colonial experience as either immoral or corrupt or completely, as in some ways we haven't been able to look at it from a point of view that, okay, this is our experience, let's see what are the different reasons we make of this experience. So as you're saying, the whole conceptualization of knowledge has come, or conceptualization of experience has come from this universal reason. So is there a scope of multiple reasons which can really look at different layers of these experience and say that, oh, everything is not immoral or problematic, which was pre-colonial in some way?
When I talk about reasons, I'm not necessarily privileging the Kantian idea of reasons. And you can be quite imaginative, really, in what counts as a reason and how you treat reasons. So an alternative to a Kantian treatment of reasons would be an Aristotelian treatment of reasons, in which you have a kind of fairly powerful idea of practical reason. And also you have the idea of reasons which are not merely exist by themselves in isolation from emotions, for example. And there was a very good paper given yesterday about the connection between reasons and emotions, much of which I would endorse. So we can think in a fairly imaginative way and a fairly expansive way as to what counts as a reason. We don't have to just track what Immanuel Kant, an 18th century Prussian gentleman, thought about reasons.
Hi, my question, I think, in a way goes back to the question about what's a bad judgment. And as I heard you, most of the criteria that were set out about what's a bad judgment seem to be focused on the outcome or the content quality. What about the process of judging or reasoning? In the current assessment context in the United States, that's very much part of assessing a good or a bad judgment or a good or a bad argument. What would you say about the process elements of judging or reasoning?
Yeah. Well, first of all, that is a good question, because I have to admit that my thinking on judgments and the process of judgments is still in the process of development. But I'm very reluctant indeed to identify the idea that there can be a process of judging which can be separated out from the content. So I think that to make a judgment, or the process of judging in making a historical judgment, is quite different from making a judgment, say, which is a literary judgment, or a judgment, say, in science. So I don't think that the process of judging can be set out independently of the disciplines. So that means that the process of judging has to be identified within the disciplines as to what that process is appropriate for that discipline or sub-discipline.
More questions. The lady in the back.
Yeah. I wanted to know your views on judging involved in practical reasoning. Here, in specifically drawing from Dunn and Pendlebury's conceptualization of practical reasoning, especially in the context of teacher education. And the second aspect that I was interested in is, again, critiquing of reason itself, and from a critical theory perspective. And how does that encroach into the space of reasons that you just enumerated?
Sorry, I didn't quite. I can't quite hear you properly, actually.
Oh, sorry. Okay. My first question related to your views on judging judgments involved in practical reasoning, especially in the context of teacher education, and reasoning involved in the practical aspects. And my second question involved critiquing of reason itself from a critical theory perspective. So how does that encroach into the spaces of reason that you just showed in your talk.
Your second question, did you say from a political theory perspective? From the perspective of political theory? Yeah, okay. Well, in answer to your first question, clearly educational practice and practical judgments is what a teacher, so to speak, is trained to make. Although I'd question as to whether you can actually train someone to make a practical judgment, but it's certainly something you learn through practice and in company with a mentor and tutor and guide. But as I said, the space of reasons operates not just at the level of theory, but also at the level of practice. If the school is a space of reasons, then yes, I fully take on your point that it's a space of reasons in the practical dimension of that, and that teacher education clearly needs to take that into account. From the point of view of political theory, well, I guess that really one can see some versions of, say, what is a polity, what is a state, as inhibiting, and some versions as encouraging. Okay, so a good example of a political theorist who I guess would encourage the space of reasons would be Machiavelli. I'm not thinking of Machiavelli, the man who wrote The Prince, but Machiavelli, the man who wrote the discourses in which he proclaimed a doctrine of civic republicanism. Civic republicanism, a civic republic, in the classic sense that goes back to the Roman Republic, is, if you like, exemplifies what I mean by a space of reason, the thrust and counter-thrust of arguments of people who are equal. Citizens, for example, live within a space of reasons. So there is a powerful tradition in political theory which articulates and exemplifies this idea of the space of reasons.